What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Two Opinionated podcast. We are your co-hosts. I'm Attorney K,
And I'm Nurse A.
and we are two opinionated women that believe that despite what we've been told, there is no such thing as being too opinionated.
So we have a YouTube channel, which you can find our handle at tooopinionated, where we release our video podcasts. You can also find us on all listening platforms, iTunes, Google, or wherever you listen to your podcast. Please rate and review us, leave us a comment, and make sure that you hit that subscribe button.
Yes, and before we jump in, we would like to shout out our sponsors, CTRL Agency. They are a talent management agency and consultancy, Black-owned and based in LA. Thanks so much, and let's get into it. Today, we are releasing our new podcast. We are, there we go, Two Opinionated. So clearly, as the title suggests, we are opinionated and outspoken advocates who challenge the status quo and bring much needed perspectives to the table in an entertaining and always thought-provoking way. What we will be doing on this podcast is examining controversial headlines and trending topics in pop culture that meet at the intersection of social justice, public policy, and popular culture.
And I think it's just important that we have a say, right? I think this is where one of the things that we don't do very often as women, as podcasters, as two women that are racialized is actually big up ourselves. And I think that's an important thing that we should actually do. I've been told many times that, you don't want to put yourself out there too much. You want to be, you don't want to excel too much. And I think that's something that we need to talk about on a whole. We need to be able to have conversations and actually support ourselves and celebrate our wins and our successes.
And that is exactly what inspired us to start this podcast. So, Nurse Amy, you and I are racialized women who are also professionals, career driven women, and also advocates that speak out on a lot of these important topics that often don't get a lot of light shed on them. And so, one of the inspirations behind us starting this podcast is to really give a voice to some of these issues and to create a space where there is no such thing as being too opinionated, because being marginalized and being underrepresented individuals in our personal and professional lives, we feel that it's very important to give a voice to certain topics and also for us to be a form of representation. So we think it's really important to create a safe space where we can talk about some of these issues that are often really not represented and really shed light on some of these narratives and the discourse so we can help to advocate for certain causes, but also create the conversation and awareness around it so that that kind of furthers the dialogue in that respect.
Yeah, and I think it's just important that as we are both racialized women who, tend to not be seen in these spaces where we're in positions of power or have influence, that it's important that we bring our voices and shed that light into these various different conversations that we might have. And I think it's important that, one, we lend our perspective, because I think the other piece is we've been told many times that maybe our perspectives aren't needed, or they're not valued, or they're not respected, especially within, coming into professions like our own. Although when we talk a little bit about ourselves, juxtaposing, one, that I'm in a female dominated profession, but there's still that hierarchical structure. And then, with you, Attorney K, that you are in kind of a male dominated structure as well, that, there are those challenges and those systems of power and inequalities. And I think that we want to be able to touch on them through a variety of different aspects, whether it's through a medical lens, a legal lens, through being racialized women, and then being also leaders within our field. But before we get into all of that, we really want to actually talk a little bit about ourselves, because I think it's actually a good thing to share a little bit about who you might be hearing on the receiving end.
Absolutely. And so one thing that we do think that will set this podcast apart is, as we examine some of these issues, what is very on brand for us is kind of addressing and analyzing the narratives that are underneath some of these topics that you'll see in pop culture and how they speak to a lot of these issues, the inequities, the, racial implications, the social justice and public policy aspects. So what is important to understand, and which we hope to share with you today as well, is a little bit about our backgrounds, professionally and personally, so that there is an understanding of the lens that we're kind of approaching some of these issues with, and that will help to inform the perspective that we're hoping to bring forth for all of you. So let's jump right in, and I will pass it off to Amy to get started.
I'm going to ask Attorney K some questions. So, the first question that I have for you, Attorney K, and of course I will answer afterwards, is tell me a little bit about yourself and why you decided to get into law. Was there a story or something that propelled you to wanting to get into the profession that you got into?
A little bit about my personal background. I am a first generation attorney, coming from a very culturally strong Asian upbringing.
Woo
First
woo!
gens. Hey.
Represent.
So proud Canadian, and I have lived and worked on both sides of the border in Canada and the US. But when my family immigrated to Canada, we faced, as new immigrants in a new world, a lot of inequities and a lot
Mm,
of challenges. And growing up, I definitely recognized that there was differential treatment. And often, as being, I'm the only one who was born in Canada as first gen. So often, a lot of the responsibility to help navigate the world and advocate on behalf of my parents, who didn't speak the language very well and were very new, and me being kind of a native born person, I started to see that common thread of advocacy and of representing people and of trying to help guide people through the world we live in. And so that responsibility kind of fell on my shoulders. So that naturally led into me taking an interest in social justice and in the law. So as I went to college and then chose law as a path, it felt very fitting for my upbringing and kind of how I was raised and what I found myself in. So that got me into the legal world. Just to break down the high level, I am a practicing attorney in Canada and the US. There's me getting called to the bar in California. Hardest bar exam ever.
oh my God, I
But
couldn't imagine.
brutal. But so I actually ended up being barred in both Canada and the US. I have practiced for a number of years in large national litigation firms, primarily focusing on civil litigation and employment law. And then I progressed and followed my dream of moving to the US and moving to Los Angeles because I became interested and fascinated in the tech startup world. And so I pivoted my career, and here's me talking about California statutes. Very exciting
Right,
stuff.
right, right.
Yes, doing speaking, consulting, advising, and a lot of things of that nature. But I found my way into the tech field and worked in startups. So now I am in Los Angeles and I work as an in house general counsel, as well as working my way up through the corporate ladder and now heading up HR departments as a chief people officer. So the journey kind of took me somewhere very different from where I started. It's me in my lawyer robes.
It's a great journey.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to see how it really the seeds are planted very early on. So
Right.
it's been an interesting path. A lot of experiences along the way, kind of growing into senior leadership, working in startup, and also practicing and advocating for clients and companies. So that is what brought me on this journey.
No, that's actually really amazing, and I think that you should really be proud of yourself that that was, your reason, your why as to why you wanted to get into the profession that you did. And I think that, you're going to make huge and positive impact. You already have. And I think that through having these conversations that we'll have, you'll continue to bring that perspective that is well needed. And I think it's an important one.
Thanks, there's Amy. I hope so. And I definitely think that you are so amazing in your own right. And one of the things that I think is really great about us kind of being this representation as women in these fields that are often challenging for us to access is to create that ideal or model for others who hope to follow our paths and what we can share
Right.
from our journeys. So I would love for you to share with our listeners a little bit about your journey and what got you into nursing and advocacy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, my story in terms of why I got into nursing, I think a lot of people talk about nursing as a calling. again, this is actually a very contentious issue for me because the reason I actually got into nursing was because I had a family member who was quite ill. And this was way back when I was probably in high school, thinking about how to navigate the healthcare system. And I remember it was my grandfather, and he had lived with us for some time. He was a World War II veteran. And I remember we actually were going to a funeral that day. And my mom, like he was such a huge member of our family, and he couldn't go that morning for whatever reason, and we left and we came back, and essentially what happened was he had a stroke. We didn't know that, but just because of some of the behaviors, my mom knew something was really wrong. So off we did. We rushed him to the hospital, and that was probably the most challenging aspect for me. We as racialized folks didn't really know how to understand the how or to navigate the system. And I think the biggest thing was also the treatment that we had. We recognized that the treatment was not the same as other folks. We were noticing that, when my mom asked questions, that people were really brusque and abrasive with her. And that was just not cool. And I remember watching my mom argue with some of the nurses, and I was just like, you know what? Hell, I think that I could do a better job than these folks. My grandpa ended up spending 8 months in the hospital, so he ended up having multiple strokes and then ended up passing away in the hospital. So spending a huge amount of time in palliative care. And I remember, so my first experience was the nurses were horrible. They were awful, and I was like, I can do better than this. And then the other piece was seeing the other side, to seeing that there were some really caring nurses, that there were some nurses that really wanted to make a change and a difference in not just my grandfather's life, but the experience that we had as people coming into the system with a loved one that was really ill. So that was kind of my entrance into coming into nursing, and that was kind of my reason why. And it was really important for me to be in that space, but I didn't really understand that until, my career continued to progress. And this is where I had a passion and love for labor and delivery, so that's kind of where I landed as a labor and delivery nurse first, and then I kind of moved on to various different roles. But really, for me, it was the pandemic really made a huge change in the way all nurses saw themselves. And I think I just decided to do something different. I had a very horrible instance of nurse bullying, which what we call lateral nursing violence, or nurse to nurse violence. And it's actually very pervasive in our profession. And I don't know if it's because it's women dominated, but it's a huge problem, a huge issue. And I was having this issue with this leader. So I had now moved from the bedside into a more leadership role as an educator in labor and delivery. And I was being gaslit, I was being harassed, and I just couldn't take it. So I decided to start a podcast talking about mental health, not really thinking anybody was listening. And really, it took on a life of its own in terms of being a nurse advocate. We think about nursing as something that, or advocacy, something that we only do at the bedside, but realizing that I could translate that into advocacy way beyond being just solely at the bedside. And this is where I actually started talking about things that were happening within our community that made huge impact. So, talking to newspaper articles, talking to mainstream media about what was really happening in healthcare, all at these various different points in times. And I just found it was something that was hugely important for me. And I never looked back. I continued having conversations about health and healthcare. I became essentially, I'm a freelance journalist, which is crazy, where I have the opportunity to, talk on live radio about healthcare issues, and not just healthcare, but anything, social justice issues, poverty, inflation, politics, war. Just being able to lend my voice in such a variety capacity, and I never really thought that I could do that. One of the biggest things was really starting the ability to be not just an advocate, but also advocating about things that we needed to see change in, which was health equity. In Canada, here, not like in the States, we don't collect racialized data, which is insane. So we don't even know of those issues that we need to fix that are specific to, racialized disparities. Although we know that race is a social construct, racism is very, very real in healthcare. And it was just something that I thought that I needed to be a part of. And here we are today having conversations about how we can move forward talking about change and using our voices as racialized women within our dominating spaces. Sorry, that was so
Absolutely.
long-winded.
No, thank you for sharing a little bit about your background. I think it's very inspiring to hear just of people who can recognize the systemic issues that we have, especially when it comes to providing care, and having a compassionate lens towards that is so important, particularly for those who face inequities like racialized persons
Right,
and
right.
women and things of that nature. So it's great to see the care that's dedicated towards this, and now advocating and bringing awareness to those issues
Mhm.
is extremely important. And so that kind of leads us into my next question for you about your profession, and what is something that most people don't know about your field of work.
Right, I think I would probably say first off the bat, most people don't understand our education and what it takes to become a nurse. I think a lot of people think, again, I think this is where I mentioned that, people are like nursing is a calling, it's an art. Nursing is a STEM, it is a science. We have to use evidence-based practices to inform the way that we deliver care. It's not just about, hairy fairy things and rubbing essential oils on people's bodies. We actually have to use critical thinking and judgment and use, scientific knowledge to make judgments in terms of care that that we provide, and just that our education is vast. There are many nurses that come to the field that you have to do a bachelor's degree, so 4 years of in within our nursing program and long clinical hours. One of the things that I get a lot was, like, "You're just a nurse, like, you've only went to school for 2 years and you only have a diploma." And it's like, "No, actually, I have a full-on bachelor's degree that was 4 years." And then even some nurses have post-secondary education even beyond that. So I also have my master's degree in nursing as well as in women's health. So just knowing that we have such a vast experience and education, that I think that's one of the things that most people don't know about nurses. What about you, Attorney Kay? What are some of the things that people might not know about your profession?
There's a lot of things I could share, but one of them that is very in line with what we are going to bring in terms of our opinion and perspectives to some of the issues we're going to talk about in this podcast series is the fact that there is so much of a systemic barrier preventing people that look like us from thriving in
Hmm,
these environments. And oftentimes, the public sentiment is either women would rather focus on their families and be at the soccer game than stay at work and work late and get that extra credit.
right.
Or, women just don't have the same level of leadership prowess and presence and things that are required to lead a company or a corporation. Things like this that are really these subconscious or conscious biases towards women and people who are racialized, and what they might perceive us as being, not as outspoken, not as forthright about, their ambitions, or not as assertive about them. I would hope that most people know this, but I'm surprised to learn that not a lot of people know this about this profession. Being just working your way up the corporate ladder into senior leadership, and getting to a C-suite role, in addition to working in law firms, there are huge, huge systemic barriers that do not make these environments a very conducive place for
Right.
women or for racialized people to succeed. And it's easy to sweep those things under the rug, but they exist. And if you identify with any of those marginalized groups, you sure as hell feel them. And a lot of people will almost gaslight you into saying, well, you should just work harder. And there are very real barriers to our success, and things that really make it even more difficult for folks like us to get to this level where we have a seat at the table and can start to influence and change that culture. So, one of the things that is a passion of mine, and is also one of our shared missions as advocates, and as we speak about the issues that we're going to address in this podcast, is the fact that there is a feeling of obligation or onus almost. We have a duty to start to create space at this table, and being
Right.
in, quite frankly, what are positions of power. We know how hard it is to get to that level. And so now that we have the honor of being in these spaces, it's a duty for us to create more space for others and create that path.
It's actually very similar within nursing too, where it's
Hmm.
just there is that hierarchical structure. It still is very of this mindset that physicians are on top, they make all the decisions, and there's this idea that although we don't say that we're handmaidens because that's what like history used to say, like nurses were handmaidens to physicians. Some of those same nuances are still seen very heavily in our profession. So yeah, I mean, I think that all of those things are really, really important. And I want to segue into our next question, which is, could you tell me, Attorney K, one thing that you're most proud of within your profession, or one accomplishment that you're most proud of?
Accomplishments. Okay, two
Hmm.
come to mind. The first is passing the whale of the California bar exam. Brutal. Nightmare. Complete nightmare. I'm most proud of it because it is one of the things that really this is kind of dramatic. It like almost broke me.
Oh dear.
I wanted to quit so many times, like just the mental challenge of it because I went to law school in Canada and I'm a trained Canadian attorney. I knew nothing, very little about American law,
Right,
other than what I had self-taught myself. I didn't go to a US law school. So, but I always had this dream of living in California and working in LA and getting into tech, right? And
right,
I wanted to take my legal training and my role as an attorney to that path, but I couldn't afford to go to school in the US. And I wanted
right.
to when I was younger and I applied, but I couldn't. So my workaround was I'm going to go to the US later and figure it out. So I had to teach myself US law so
Wow.
that I could pass the bar. And I took the bar several times because I had no idea what I was doing. So, as I'm working full time and studying at night and on weekends, trying to teach myself US law
Wow.
and taking the bar more than a couple times. So,
Jeez.
there were periods where I was just like, I'm done. I'm not doing this. Like, screw my dream. I'm going home. So, when I say it almost broke me, I'm typically someone with a lot of mental conviction and strength. And this was one of those things where I thought I was just gonna let it beat me. And I was like, I'm gonna go home. But I didn't. And I kept pushing through. And I think with the last bit that I had in me, I was like, I'm gonna give it one more shot. And it worked out. So motto
That's
of the story is you gotta
amazing.
keep pushing because you're
Right,
almost
right.
there. When you want to stop, you're almost there.
That's
So that
amazing.
thanks. So that's one thing. The other thing that I am proud of and that I feel proud of every time I'm reminded is, we talked about earlier working in fields that are often male dominated or like yours where there's a lot of women, but it's always at certain levels, not in
Right,
senior levels.
right,
So, in my experience in working in law firms and litigation, being in courtrooms, and then being in boardrooms as a corporate executive, working my way up the corporate ladder, always walking into rooms where I am either the only woman, the only person of color, but almost always the only woman of color. So being the diversity is something I'm very used to. And while it can be frustrating at times, I also feel proud when I walk into a boardroom of 12 people, doing some big deal and I'm the only woman of color there. And it's more about what that represents and less about like, well, I'm here with the big dogs.
right,
It's
right.
that we are at a point in society where although it's not common, it's possible. And it
Mm,
represents to me, all the sacrifices that my family, my parents had made to try to come to the country and create opportunity and give us a different shot at winning in life. And
yeah.
so, when I'm in those rooms and I realize how difficult it is to be that one person, it represents to me that things are changing and that I can help to create more space for others to do the same.
Oh, that's so good. No, I'm, like, super proud of you. That's actually amazing, and I think that there there needs to be more women of color taking up
Absolutely.
those spaces, and I think those like, the diversity and inclusion and having those voices are like, companies are missing out, to be honest. Like, it's
Absolutely.
not just about having everybody that looks the same, that thinks the same, that representation brings something unique to the table. And it there we can't say more about it, that having unique experiences brings something different to the table that, the status quo and the norm don't. And, I applaud you. I think the world of you. I remember looking at just even studying for law exams in Canada, because I remember saying to my husband, like, "Hey, why don't you go for law?" He's
I
like, "Hell
remember
no."
that you wanted to go to law school a
And
certain
I remember
time.
even well, because he was like, "My Latin is shit." Like, I can't figure out this whole logic situation. And I remember just looking at some of it, I was like, that is some really difficult work. So, I mean, kudos to you, and, you should be proud of yourself.
Thank you, thank you. I mean, I think that I love having these conversations with you because you inspire me all the time with the work you do as well. And I love this for us as women, as people of color, as people that are marginalized, period. Whatever it is that
Right,
you
right,
relate to, that you are not status quo. I love to see it. I love it for us. And it's so important because I continue to go into these spaces where there are just so few women. Like it's
right,
wild to me to look at these corporations and these boards, just a monotonous sea of old white men.
right.
And not that I have anything against old white men, but that is not the only perspective that should be voiced at the table. And they are making decisions for companies and for people that impact their livelihood and laws and legislation and policy and society. And you
Mhm.
cannot have a diverse and helpful organization or set of policies or way of doing things with only one ideal of representation. So
Right,
it's
no, I
so
agree with
important for us to be in these spaces. And that fits perfectly into talking about you and what you've done in your profession that you are proud of and that are accomplishments, because I know for a fact that when I see you advocating on behalf of the nurse's voice and of people who are seeking, equitable care, it's so important and it's such a huge accomplishment. So please tell us more about that.
that. Okay. Well, that's a lot. I think that one of the things that I'm probably most proud of is one of the things that is very unique to nursing is we are seen, but we are not heard, right? You hear that nursing is the most trusted profession, but you don't often hear from nurses. You don't hear from them in the media, where these kind of angelic figures can't do any wrong.
That's very
But
true.
the
You
thing is,
don't.
there we don't have any say. We didn't have influence. We don't get to sit at these tables where they make huge decisions about healthcare. And I remember thinking to myself, like, how odd is it that, we're making all these decisions, and there are no nurses that have worked at the bedside, or in the last, 5 years, 10 years, some 20 plus years, that are able to have a say or have a voice. And I think that there's so much silencing in our profession. There's so much fear about speaking out and speaking to the media, talking about things and concerns that we see that surround patient safety, that a lot of us feel muzzled. And I remember, when I had my instance of, struggling with mental health through a situation with nursing, that I decided to never be silent anymore. So I'd say one of the things that I'm most proud of is the fact that I took a chance. I decided to use my voice. I decided to use my knowledge, skill, and judgment and expertise in nursing, because as nurses, we are experts as well, to talk about the things that really mean a lot to me. So, talking about mental health, talking about health equity, talking about, nursing as a profession, and why do we not have these seats at the table? And having that voice in the media, I think that was huge, because you don't see a lot of nurses when they call an expert, they call a physician, but
They
why
call the
don't they
doctors. We hear from the doctors,
but
but you
why don't they
guys
call
have
the We're the ones
you
that are with the patients
right. You have
24.
the firsthand knowledge. Like you're in the best position to speak to it.
Right. It's really looking at those same systems of oppression within our nursing cycles, within our,
Hmm.
there is systemic racism within our own medical hierarchy, and really breaking those things down. And I had the opportunity to have a little bit of a platform and to kind of just take it and run with it. So one of the biggest things I'm proud of is having that voice and having that say within those spaces, within, larger conversations, because I feel the other piece is I don't just talk about nursing. I talk about health equity. I talk about outcomes that we want to see in patients and families' lives. And this kind of segues into the other thing that I'm most proud of is really bringing forward national, international conversation on health equity. I know there again are more conversations that are happening in the states because you do collect racialized data, and we don't do that here in Canada. So it's a huge piece that I'm trying to kind of bring forward and bring to light that just because we have anecdotes, we have stories that are hugely powerful, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't make changes in terms of the metrics and outcomes using evidence-based data, using those same anecdotes to make changes. So I'd say those are two of the biggest things that I'm most proud of. And I just think that it's important that we take up space. I think that we have to be seen in these spaces because if not us, who else then, right? Who
Mm,
else will
mm.
fill that role? Who else will say that this is how things should go, not seeing it from a different lens, not seeing it from a different perspective? So I feel that, being in this space, being able to take up those space, have those types of conversations are hugely important for me as a nurse and for our profession.
I'm doing a round of applause because tell them, let them know.
You're
It
s- you're,
it
you're
brings
too kind. You're too kind.
let them know. Let them know. Big up yourself.
Right, right, right.
It brings something to mind. We talk about this, right? About the imposter syndrome that is
Mm,
often,
so real.
felt by folks that can identify with some of these struggles. And it is important to big up yourself and recognize the change that you're making, and it's tough. And when every time you stick your neck out, when we're expected to be quiet, expected to be silenced and keep your head down, it creates real change, and it creates representation for other people to identify with, and to also be encouraged to speak up and to advocate for the things that they believe are right. It reminds me of one anecdote as well when we're talking about accomplishments. You've done so much for the broader population of healthcare professionals and nurses and just public policy as it relates to health equity and access to healthcare. And I think about some of the things that in my personal journey I've been able to impact that are at a broader level, that I felt not only the need for, but the passion to fight for, because I could identify with it, because I
Right.
understood that plight. And that's why it's so important to bring diverse voices to the table. What I'm thinking of is in one of these scenarios, and often they are largely male. And it's very difficult in the corporate space to create a work culture that allows women what they need to be able to have an equitable shot at rising into levels of senior leadership and just
Right.
progressing their career, even if it's not in senior leadership, but just having a long lasting, thriving, and successful career. And one of the things that I advocated for was a fair and generous parental leave program. And I can't tell you the amount of ignorance that
I
there
believe it.
was around how parental leave impacts women disproportionately to men. We shouldn't only be giving women mat leave benefits, but we
Right.
should be allowing parents to choose who they would like to take on childcare responsibilities and leave the workforce for periods of time.
Right,
And
right.
they couldn't understand why we would give men or fathers parental leave benefits, because aren't we here to help the women? And I remember breaking down, and I don't blame them for the ignorance, but it is really surprising that we wouldn't try to create spaces for other diverse voices who understand this stuff a little bit easier, or maybe inherently because they identify with it. And so I
Right.
remember breaking down why, like, if we only give the opportunity for women to take mat leave, then they're the ones who have to leave the workforce, and it has
Right.
to impact their career trajectory and their income and all of this, while the male or the father, or whoever the parental role is, not to be gender specific,
Mhm.
has to stay at work. And then when the parent of the child who chose to stay home and raise the child goes back to work, they are now significantly disadvantaged, and they've been set back, and it's often very difficult to return and resume to your life in the
Right.
professional space, because you are the primary person responsible for care. And so just topics like this, where in companies where there was no parental leave benefits for anybody in the first place, seeing that type of change, knowing that it's impacting the hundreds of employees that, and hopefully the companies that these people go on to lead or have an impact on later, it's such a huge positive for so many people, I hope. And the ability that we have to give a voice to things like this, and hopefully what we can do through our podcast as well, is like shed light on these things to really create these waves of change. And I love that. It's a beautiful thing. So we are using our voices, hopefully, for the things that are important.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's exactly what we're doing, and I think that we'd be remiss if we don't. I think that's the other piece
Hmm.
about advocacy and being an advocate, that it's also about action, and this is
Right.
actually a part of the action piece. I think that most people would think that, action only is, going out there and yelling or being an advocate in the streets, which we do as well. But
Hmm.
actually through
Sure
having these
will.
conversations, of course, right? But through having these conversations too, with other people listening, we can give people those aha moments or food for thought to say, "Hey, you know what?
Hmm.
Maybe I do need to do something different." Or, "Hey, maybe we need to get those girls to come and have a conversation with our workforce in
Okay.
terms of some change." You know what I'm saying,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
But,
Hey, I mean that's a perfect opportunity for us to do a little bit of a plug on, the type of work that we do as well, and the type
right.
of things that we are available to help out with in terms of furthering some of these dialogues, and consulting and speaking on things like this. Why don't you give us a little bit of a breakdown of some of the things that you've worked on and things that we can do?
Okay. I mean, I think that I've done a range of different things. And I think this is something that we both can do collaboratively, where I've been able to hold workshops where we have groups of individuals talking about, change management, advocating for change or what that looks like within your workplace, your community, your personal life, talking about, healthcare and how that might intersect with policy, privilege, and power. Obviously, the opportunity to have keynote speaking and speaking directly to members of, different companies or organizations. I have to be honest, I love talking to universities and students, because I think those are the minds
Yes,
that, because I think sometimes it's really hard to change individuals' minds. Change management is a whole field in itself.
it is.
But talking to the younger generation, they are our future, right? Students at university and college, high schools, those are the areas that I feel make huge impacts. And really just being a part of greater change. So really having our voice in different spaces. I think there's many different opportunities for us to show our resiliency, our grit, our strength, our voices in a variety of different capacities.
Working in corporations and heading up HR, so human resources, being in the role of a chief people officer, where I am responsible for strategizing for programming and things like this for our populations. Often, we're held responsible for training and increasing awareness around subconscious bias in the workplace, and how to create policy and change that will further the needs that those diverse populations require, hiring, talent acquisition, things like that. And oftentimes the people that are responsible for creating this programming, they may or may not have the bandwidth or the knowledge to speak on these things and to effectively teach upcoming leaders. And so one of the things that I do as well is workshops and training modules for management and things of that nature. The most recent one I did was on change management, actually. And you are absolutely right. It is a whole discipline
A whole
in
different
and of
beast.
itself. And it's very challenging because to change a whole culture, it takes a lot of strategy and knowledge and intention. So
Right.
that is something that I have done often for the companies that I've worked for, and also do on an individual capacity in terms of consulting and speaking to groups of management, companies, law firms, and like you said, schools. I think we have a soft spot for education. I love higher education.
Right.
So, really doing workshops and influencing those minds for the future is super important, and all stuff that we are very passionate about speaking about and would love to assist if this is something that is of interest to you. And it doesn't only have to be during Black History Month or Anti-Asian Hate Month or
Right.
Women's Month, Heritage Day. Anywho, so
We're available at
let's
all times.
right, at all times, all year long. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the other piece is we'll probably drop a link to our media kit in terms of different things that we can really speak to so you can have a really clear idea of what you might be able to reach out to us for.
Yes, we will drop a link to our media kit below in case you are interested in exploring some of our speaking and consulting services. We would be happy to chat with you to see how we might be able to help.
Absolutely. So, thank you so much for joining us here on the Two Opinionated podcast. If you like what you hear, please support us by hitting that subscribe button below. Our YouTube channel handle is at Two Opinionated. And of course, we'll release our podcast on all of the various listening platforms.
Yes, so please check us out on YouTube. Let us know if you are liking what we're talking about so far. We have some really interesting programming about a variety of topics. We are planning to release our Tory Lane's trial and sentencing
Right?
episode. We are talking about deepfake porn. We're talking
Yeah,
about TikTok terminations. There's some interesting topics here. So please join us. Let us know in our YouTube comments if you have thoughts or anything you wanted to comment on in terms of topics to talk about. And leave us any questions and, of course, your opinions, because there is no such thing as being too opinionated.
never.
And quickly before we go, we would just like to shout out our sponsor, CTRL Agency. They are a talent management agency and consultancy, Black owned and based in LA. We appreciate you for sponsoring our podcast, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks so much.